in the rugged Colorado territory of 1875, where the morning mist danced between towering peaks and wild mustangs roamed free across endless plains. Love had a way of finding the most unexpected hearts. They called him Big Jake Sullivan, a mountain of a man who stood 7 feet tall in his weathered boots, with hands that could gentle the wildest bronco, yet handle a rope with the precision of an artist painting on canvas. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But for all his size and skill with cattle, Jake had never encountered anything quite like the emerald-eyed saloon girl who would change everything he thought he knew about himself. This is the story of how the biggest cowboy in 3 territories learned that sometimes the smallest touch can bring down the mightiest walls, and how a woman with nothing but her wits and courage could tame a heart that had been locked away for far too long. The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and distant snow as it swept down from Thunder Ridge, rustling through the golden aspens that lined the main street of Silverbrook, Colorado territory. The town sat nestled in a valley where 3 rivers converged, creating some of the richest grazing land west of the Mississippi. Cattle barons and small ranchers alike had staked their claims here, drawn by the promise of prosperity and the kind of freedom that only the frontier could offer. Main Street stretched for half a mile between wooden sidewalks, lined with the essential establishments that kept civilization flickering in the wilderness. Hayes General Store, the Silverbrook Hotel, Doc Samuel Hayes Medical Practice, and at the heart of it all, the Silver Dollar Saloon, where fortunes were won and lost over cards and whiskey. It was a Tuesday morning when Jake Sullivan first rode into Silverbrook, leading a string of the finest horses anyone in the territory had ever seen. The sight of him alone was enough to make folks stop what they were doing and stare. At 7 feet tall, Jake dwarfed his massive black stallion, Thunder, yet he rode with such natural grace that horse and rider seemed to move as one entity. His shoulders were broad enough to block out the sun, and his arms looked capable of wrestling a bear to the ground. Yet there was something gentle in his deep blue eyes that spoke of a man who understood the value of quiet strength over loud boasting. Sheriff Tom Bradley was the first to approach the newcomer, his experienced lawman's instincts automatically cataloging details about any stranger who rode into his territory. Jake's clothes were well-made but practical, his gear expensive but functional, and most telling of all, he wore no gun on his hip. In a land where most men considered their Colt revolvers as essential as their boots, this absence spoke volumes about either supreme confidence or deliberate choice. "Morning, stranger," Bradley called out, touching the brim of his hat in the universal gesture of frontier courtesy. "Tom Bradley, Sheriff of Silverbrook. Mind if I ask what brings you to our little corner of paradise?" Jake's voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly soft for such a large man, carrying the hint of an accent that suggested origin somewhere in the green hills of Ireland. "Jake Sullivan, Sheriff. I'm looking to buy some land, maybe start a spread of my own. Heard tell this valley grows good grass and better cattle." The honesty in his tone and the directness of his gaze immediately put Bradley at ease. Too many drifters came through with shifty eyes and elaborate stories, but this giant spoke with the straightforward manner of a man who had nothing to hide. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, you've come to the right place for that. Frank Morrison over at the bank handles most of the land sales, though I'd recommend talking to Martha Williams at the general store first. She knows every acre in the valley and who's looking to sell." As Jake guided his horses toward the hitching post outside Williams' store, curious faces appeared in windows and doorways throughout the town. Word traveled fast in small communities, and by the time he'd dismounted, half of Silverbrook knew that a giant cowboy with a string of prime horses had arrived. Children peeked around their mothers' skirts, fascinated by a man who seemed to have stepped out of the tall tales their fathers told around campfires. Martha Williams emerged from her store before Jake could even reach the door, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of this impressive newcomer. A widow who'd built her business through shrewd observation and careful judgment of character, Martha had survived 20 years on the frontier by reading people as easily as she read her ledger. Books. What she saw in Jake Sullivan impressed her immediately. Clean clothes despite long travel, well-maintained equipment, and horses that showed the kind of care that spoke of both means and character. "You'd be the gentleman looking for land," she said without preamble, extending a weathered hand that Jake shook with surprising gentleness for such massive fingers. Martha Williams. "I own this establishment and probably know more about available property than anyone else in the territory." "Jake Sullivan, ma'am. Pleased to make your acquaintance." His polite manner and respectful tone further endeared him to Martha, who'd grown tired of rough men who treated women as afterthoughts. "I'm hoping to find a place where I can raise horses and maybe run some cattle. Looking for good water and room to grow." Martha's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed matching the right people with the right opportunities. "Well now, Mr. Sullivan, I believe fate has smiled on both of us today. There's a property about 5 miles north of town that's been sitting empty since old Samuel Crawford passed last spring. His nephew back east has been trying to sell it, and frankly, we've all been hoping the right buyer would come along." She gestured toward the mountains visible through her store window, where autumn sunlight painted the peaks in shades of gold and amber. The Circle S Ranch, they called it. 800 acres of the finest grazing land you'll find anywhere, with Willow Creek running right through the heart of it. There's a good house, solid barn, and corrals already built. Crawford spent 30 years building that place up right. Jake listened intently, his experienced eyes already calculating possibilities and potential. "What's the asking price, if you don't mind me inquiring?" $3,000, Martha replied, watching his reaction carefully. "I know it sounds steep, but you won't find better land at any price. Crawford's nephew is motivated to sell, especially to someone who'll respect what his uncle built." The price was fair, Jake knew, perhaps even generous for such prime property. He'd saved carefully during his years working spreads throughout Texas and Wyoming, and his horse trading had proven profitable enough to make such a purchase possible. More importantly, something about Silverbrook felt right in a way that other towns hadn't. There was a sense of community here, of people who looked out for one another without being suspicious of outsiders. "I'd like to see the property," he said finally. "If it's everything you say, we might have ourselves a deal." Martha beamed with satisfaction. "I'll have my boy Jimmy saddle up a horse and guide you out there this afternoon. In the meantime, you might want to stable your animals and get yourself some dinner. The Silver Dollar serves the best beef stew this side of Denver, and Hank Carter runs an honest establishment." As Jake led his horses toward the livery stable, he couldn't help but notice the Silver Dollar Saloon across the street. Even in the afternoon, the sound of piano music drifted through the batwing doors, mixing with occasional laughter and the gentle clink of glasses. Unlike many frontier saloons, this one seemed more welcoming than threatening, the kind of place where a man could enjoy a quiet drink without worrying about trouble finding him. Old Pete Murphy, the livery stable owner, emerged to greet Jake, with the bow-legged gait of a man who'd spent 60 years in the saddle. His eyes widened as he took in Jake's impressive height, but his attention quickly shifted to the horses, and what he saw there made him whistle low with appreciation. "Sweet Jesus and Mary," Pete breathed, running experienced hands over Thunder's flanks. "Haven't seen horseflesh this fine since before the war. You breed these yourself, son?" "Some of them," Jake replied, pleased by the old horseman's obvious expertise. "Bought others from folks who knew quality when they saw it. I've got a good eye for bloodlines and the patience to train them right." Pete nodded approvingly as he examined each animal in turn. "Well, you've come to the right territory for horses. Plenty of wild stock in these mountains, and the altitude builds strong lungs and good wind. You planning to set up breeding operations? Thinking about it. Depends on what I find when I look at the Crawford place this afternoon. Jake pulled his saddlebags from Thunder's back, the leather worn smooth by years of use but still well maintained. Right now I'm more interested in getting some food in my belly and maybe a beer to wash the trail dust away. The Silver Dollar. Saloon proved to be exactly as Martha had described, clean, well run, and surprisingly refined for a frontier establishment. The floors were swept, the glasses were clean, and the smell of good cooking wafted from the kitchen in back. A magnificent mahogany bar dominated one wall, its surface polished to a mirror shine, while round tables filled the main floor. In the far corner, an upright piano sat silent for the moment, waiting for the evening crowd when music would fill the air. Hank Carter, the proprietor, was a compact man with graying hair and intelligent eyes who moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to read crowds and prevent trouble before it started. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He looked up from cleaning glasses as Jake ducked through the doorway, his massive frame requiring him to bend slightly to avoid the lintel. "Welcome to the Silver Dollar," Hank said with genuine warmth. "You'd be the gentleman Martha mentioned might be stopping by. I'm Hank Carter, and this is my establishment. Jake Sullivan. Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Carter." Jake removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair slightly mussed from the trail. "I was told you serve the finest beef stew in these parts." "Well, I'd hate to disappoint a customer by being modest," Hank grinned. "Take any table you like, and I'll have Emma bring you out a bowl. You look like a man who could handle a double portion." As Jake settled into a sturdy chair that creaked, only slightly under his weight, he became aware of movement in the back of the saloon. A young woman emerged from what appeared to be a small office, carrying a ledger book and wearing a simple but well-made dress in deep blue that complemented her auburn hair. She moved with natural grace, her posture erect and confident, and when she looked up and met Jake's eyes, he felt something shift inside his chest like tumblers falling into place in a lock. Rose McKenna had been working at the Silver Dollar for nearly 2 years, ever since arriving in Silverbrook with little more than the clothes on her back and a determination to make her own way in the world. Unlike many women who found themselves in similar circumstances, Rose had never compromised her principles or allowed desperation to drive her to choices she might later regret. Instead, she'd proven herself invaluable to Hank Carter through her quick mind, honest nature, and ability to handle even the roughest customers with a combination of wit and firmness that earned their respect. At 23, Rose possessed the kind of beauty that came not just from pleasing features, but from intelligence and character that shone through her emerald eyes. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the saloon's windows, and her smile, when it appeared, could light up the darkest corner of any room. She'd learned to be cautious around strangers, especially men, but something about the giant cowboy sitting alone at the corner table struck her as different from the usual run of drifters and troublemakers. "Emma's busy in the kitchen," she sighed, approaching Jake's table with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with all manner of customers. "I'm Rose McKenna. Mr. Carter said you'd like to try our stew." Jake found himself momentarily speechless, not from shyness, but from the unexpected impact of her presence. He'd known many women during his travels, some beautiful, some intelligent, some kind, but never had he encountered someone who seemed to possess all three qualities in such perfect balance. When he finally found his voice, it came out softer than usual, tinged with a respect that surprised even him. "Yes, ma'am. Jake Sullivan, and I'd be much obliged for that stew. And maybe a beer if you have any cold." Rose noted the genuine politeness in his manner, the way he stood slightly when addressing her, and the complete absence of the leering or crude comments that too often accompanied interactions with frontier men. His size might have been intimidating, but his gentle voice and respectful demeanor put her immediately at ease. "We keep beer cold in the root cellar," she replied, her own voice warming with approval at his mannerly approach. "I'll bring you a mug with your meal. Are you just passing through Silverbrook, Mr. Sullivan, or might we be seeing more of you?" "Well, Miss McKenna, that depends on whether I can work out a deal for some land hereabouts. I'm hoping to settle down, maybe start a horse ranch." Jake's eyes met hers briefly before he looked down at his hands, suddenly feeling like an awkward schoolboy despite his 32 years. "Seems like a good place to put down roots." Something in his tone suggested he was talking about more than just land and business prospects, and Rose felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Most men who expressed interest in settling down around her had far different intentions than what his respectful manner suggested, but there was an honesty in Jake Sullivan's blue eyes that spoke of genuine character. "Well," she said, her smile brightening, "I hope things work out for you. We can always use more good people in Silverbrook." As Rose disappeared into the kitchen to fetch his meal, Jake found himself watching the doorway long after she'd gone, feeling strangely unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with travel, fatigue, or uncertainty about land purchases. He'd always prided himself on being a practical man, focused on tangible goals like building a successful ranch and establishing himself in the community. Romance had never been a priority, partly because his imposing size often intimidated potential partners, and partly because he'd never met anyone who stirred the kind of feelings that made a man reconsider his carefully planned future. The stew, when Rose returned with it, proved to be every bit as excellent as advertised. Rich with tender beef and vegetables, seasoned with herbs that spoke of genuine culinary skill, it was the kind of meal that made a traveling man appreciate the possibility of regular home cooking. The beer was cold and crisp, perfect for washing away the dust of long miles, and Jake found himself savoring both the food and the occasional opportunities to catch glimpses of Rose as she moved efficiently around the saloon. "You're new here, aren't you?" The voice belonged to a well-dressed man who'd approached Jake's table without invitation, his manner suggesting the kind of confidence that came from local influence and substantial means. Frank Morrison was perhaps 45, with carefully groomed hair and clothes that spoke of prosperity, but there was something in his eyes that Jake instinctively distrusted. "Frank Morrison," the man continued, extending a hand that Jake shook briefly out of politeness. "I own the largest spread in the valley, plus I have interests in the bank and several other local businesses. Always like to meet newcomers, especially those with obvious means." Jake's response was polite but cool. "Jake Sullivan. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Morrison." Morrison settled into the chair across from Jake without being invited, his manner suggesting he was accustomed to inserting himself into any situation that interested him. "I understand you're looking at the old Crawford place. Beautiful property, though it's been neglected since Samuel passed. Might be more than one man could handle, especially someone unfamiliar with local conditions." There was something in Morrison's tone that suggested this wasn't merely friendly conversation, and Jake's instincts, honed by years of dealing with all manner of men, warned him to be cautious. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Morrison, but I've been working cattle and horses most of my life. I reckon I can handle whatever challenges come up." Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm sure you're capable, Mr. Sullivan. It's just that this valley can be challenging for newcomers. Established operations have certain advantages, and sometimes it makes more sense for everyone involved if new arrivals consider partnerships rather than going it alone." The veiled threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Jake felt his jaw tighten slightly. He'd encountered men like Morrison before, those who believed their local influence gave them the right to dictate terms to others. "I appreciate the advice, but I prefer to make my own way. Always have." Before Morrison could respond, Rose appeared at their table, ostensibly to refill Jake's beer mug, but clearly aware of the tension in the conversation. "Is everything all right here, gentlemen?" she asked, her tone perfectly polite, but her eyes sending a clear message to Morrison that his presence wasn't particularly welcome. Morrison's expression shifted as he looked at Rose, and Jake didn't like what he saw there. There was a possessiveness in the man's gaze, a sense of entitlement that made Jake's hands clench involuntarily under the table. "Everything's fine. Rose, I was just welcoming Mr. Sullivan to our community and offering some friendly advice about local business opportunities." "How thoughtful of you, Mr. Morrison," Rose replied, her tone carrying just enough edge to suggest she was familiar with the man's particular brand of thoughtfulness. "I'm sure Mr. Sullivan appreciates your guidance." Morrison stood, his smile never wavering, but his eyes showing a flash of irritation at the subtle rebuke. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, I hope you'll give some thought to what I've said. The Valley works best when everyone understands their place and respects established arrangements." After Morrison left, Rose lingered for a moment longer than necessary, refilling Jake's mug even though it was still nearly full. "Don't let Frank Morrison discourage you from pursuing your plans, Mr. Sullivan. Silverbrook needs more good people, and from what I can tell, you seem like exactly the kind of man this community could use." Her words carried more weight than simple encouragement, and Jake found himself looking into her eyes with growing appreciation for both her kindness and her apparent courage in standing up to Morrison's intimidation. "Thank you, Miss McKenna. That means more than you might realize." As the afternoon progressed and Jimmy Williams arrived to guide him to the Crawford property, Jake found his thoughts divided between practical considerations about land and water rights and the completely unexpected development of his attraction to Rose McKenna. The ride to the Circle S Ranch should have commanded his full attention, as the property was everything Martha had promised and more: rolling pastures dotted with mature trees, Willow Creek running clear and strong through the heart of the spread, and buildings that showed the loving care of a man who'd built something meant to last. Standing on the porch of the ranch house as the sun began to set behind the mountains, Jake could envision the life he might build here. Horses grazing in the pastures, cattle growing fat on the rich grass, and perhaps, if he was very fortunate, a woman with emerald eyes and auburn hair, sharing the dreams he was only beginning to allow himself to imagine. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Sullivan was thinking about something more than just personal success and financial security. He was thinking about home, about family, about the kind of future he'd never dared to hope might be possible. For a man of his size and solitary nature, the price was fair, the land was perfect, and the town had already shown him more genuine welcome in one afternoon than he'd found in years of wandering. Most importantly, there was Rose McKenna, whose brief smiles and respectful manner had awakened something in his heart that he'd thought might never stir. As he rode back toward Silverbrook with young Jimmy chattering about local history and pointing out landmarks, Jake made his decision. Tomorrow he would finalize the purchase of the Circle S Ranch, and then he would begin the careful process of discovering whether a saloon girl with emerald eyes might be interested in learning more about the gentle giant who just decided to make Silverbrook his permanent home. The morning sun had barely crested Thunder Ridge when Jake Sullivan made his way back into Silverbrook, his saddlebags heavy with the cash needed to purchase the Circle S Ranch. He'd spent a restless night at the Silverbrook Hotel, his mind alternating between practical considerations about running a horse operation and completely impractical thoughts about a certain auburn-haired saloon girl who'd managed to turn his carefully ordered world upside down with nothing more than a kind smile and respectful manner. The bank wouldn't open for another hour, but Jake found himself drawn to the Silver Dollar, where early morning light filtered through dusty windows and the smell of fresh coffee suggested that someone was already preparing for the day ahead. He pushed through the batwing doors to find Rose McKenna sweeping the floor with efficient strokes, her hair pinned back in a practical bun, that somehow made her look even more beautiful than she had the day before. "You're an early riser, Mr. Sullivan," she said, looking up with a smile that made his pulse quicken despite his determination to remain calm and collected. "Most folks don't stir for another hour or so, especially after a night in Mrs. Henderson's hotel. Her beds aren't exactly known for their comfort." "Old habits, I suppose," Jake replied, removing his hat and hanging it carefully on a nearby peg. "Spent most of my life getting up before dawn to tend horses. Besides, I was hoping to catch some coffee before I head over to the bank." Rose leaned her broom against the wall and moved behind the bar, where a large coffee pot sat warming on a small stove. "Well, you're in luck. I always make extra for the early customers." She poured a generous cup of the steaming brew and set it before him, her fingers brushing his briefly as he reached for the handle. The contact was brief but electric, sending an unexpected jolt through both of them. "So," Rose said, trying to ignore the warmth that had spread up her arm from that simple touch, "I take it you've decided to make an offer on the Crawford place?" Jake nodded, wrapping his large hands around the coffee cup and savoring both the warmth and the excuse to stay in Rose's company a little longer. "It's everything Martha Williams said it would be. Good water, rich grass, and buildings that just need a little attention to be as fine as any in the territory." There was something in his voice that suggested he was talking about more than just the practical aspects of ranch ownership, and Rose found herself studying his face with growing interest. Yesterday, she'd been impressed by his courtesy and gentle manner, but this morning she was beginning to see deeper qualities that intrigued her even more. There was a quiet confidence about Jake Sullivan that had nothing to do with arrogance or boasting, and a kindness in his eyes that suggested a man who'd learned to value character over appearances. "I'm glad," she said softly. "Silverbrook could use more people like you. Too many drifters come through looking for easy money or quick schemes. It's refreshing to meet someone who wants to build something lasting." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Doc Samuel Hayes, a distinguished gentleman in his 50s who served as both the town's physician and one of its most respected citizens. Doc Hayes had delivered half the babies in Silverbrook, patched up countless injuries, and earned a reputation for both medical skill and unshakable integrity that made his opinion carry considerable weight in local matters. "Good morning, Rose," Doc Hayes said warmly, then turned to study Jake with the penetrating gaze of a man accustomed to quickly assessing both physical condition and character. "And you must be the gentleman everyone's talking about." "Samuel Hayes, though most folks just call me Doc." Jake rose to shake the older man's hand, his natural courtesy making a positive impression on someone who'd learned to judge men by their actions rather than their words. "Jake Sullivan." "Doc, pleased to meet you. I understand you're looking to settle in our valley," Doc Hayes continued, accepting a cup of coffee from Rose with a grateful nod. "Martha Williams seems quite taken with your plans, and she's not easily impressed." "The land suits me fine," Jake replied. "Good grass, clean water, and room to grow. Everything a man needs to build a proper horse operation." Doc Hayes nodded approvingly. "We could use more horse breeding in this territory. Too many folks rely on whatever stock they can catch wild or buy from passing traders. Quality bloodlines make all the difference, whether you're working cattle or just trying to get from one place to another safely." As the three of them talked, Rose found herself increasingly drawn to Jake's quiet wisdom and obvious expertise. He spoke about horses with the passion of someone who truly understood and loved the animals, describing breeding principles and training methods with an enthusiasm that lit up his entire face. More importantly, he listened when others spoke, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest in Doc Hayes' stories about the early days of Silverbrook settlement. Their pleasant morning conversation was interrupted by the sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk outside, followed by the appearance of Frank Morrison and two men Rose didn't recognize. The strangers had the hard look of professional gunmen, their clothes dusty from travel and their eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. Morrison himself looked different from the previous day, his usual veneer of civilized respectability replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "Mr. Sullivan," Morrison said without preamble, his voice carrying a tone that made Rose instinctively step closer to Jake. "I was hoping we might continue our conversation from yesterday. Perhaps somewhere more private." Jake's expression didn't change, but Rose noticed his hands shift slightly, positioning himself between her and the three newcomers. "I believe we said everything that needed saying yesterday. Mr. Morrison, I'm not interested in partnerships or arrangements." One of Morrison's companions, a lean man with a scar running down his left cheek, spoke up with barely concealed menace. "Maybe you didn't understand the situation properly. Friend, Mr. Morrison was trying to be polite yesterday, but politeness sometimes gets misunderstood." Doc Hayes set down his coffee cup with deliberate calm, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the confrontation developing in front of him. "Frank, I don't believe we've met your friends here. They're not from around Silverbrook, are they?" Morrison's smile was cold and calculating. "Business associates from Denver, Doc. Men who understand how things work in territories where the law might be flexible in certain circumstances." The threat was unmistakable now, and Rose felt her heart begin to pound with a mixture of fear and anger. She'd seen Morrison's true nature revealed in subtle ways over the past months, but this was the first time he'd shown such open intimidation in front of witnesses. The presence of hired guns suggested that his interest in Jake's plans went beyond simple business competition. Jake remained perfectly still, his voice quiet but carrying an undertone that made even the professional gunman pause slightly. "Doc Hayes, Miss McKenna, I think it might be best if you folks stepped outside for a few minutes. This appears to be a private business discussion." "I'm not leaving," Rose said firmly, her emerald eyes flashing with determination. "This is my workplace, and I don't appreciate strangers making threats in it." Morrison's expression darkened as he looked at Rose, and something ugly flickered in his eyes. "You might want to reconsider your loyalties, Rose. This valley has ways of dealing with people who don't understand their place." The words were barely out of Morrison's mouth when Jake moved, his massive frame shifting with surprising speed to place himself directly between Morrison and Rose. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shouted threat could have managed. "You'll address Miss McKenna with respect, or you won't address her at all." The scarred gunman's hand drifted toward his weapon, but he found himself looking up into Jake's eyes and hesitating. There was something in those blue depths that suggested Jake Sullivan might be considerably more dangerous than his gentle manner indicated. The second gunman, reading the situation with professional instincts, positioned himself to Jake's left, but neither man seemed eager to be the first to draw. Doc Hayes, who'd lived through the worst of the frontier violence and learned to recognize the signs of impending bloodshed, spoke up with calm authority. "Frank, I suggest you and your friends conduct your business elsewhere. The Silver Dollar isn't the place for this kind of discussion." Morrison studied Jake for a long moment, clearly trying to gauge whether this giant cowboy might be more than he'd initially appeared. The respectful way Jake had treated Rose, combined with his obvious lack of fear in the face of armed intimidation, suggested depths that Morrison hadn't anticipated. "This isn't over, Sullivan," Morrison said finally. "You'd be wise to reconsider my offer before you make any permanent decisions about that property." After the three men left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the saloon. Rose was visibly shaken, not by fear for herself, but by the realization of how far Morrison was apparently willing to go to maintain his control over the valley. Doc Hayes poured himself another cup of coffee with hands that trembled slightly, while Jake stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the doorway through which Morrison had departed. "I'm sorry you folks got dragged into that," Jake said finally, his voice heavy with regret. I had no idea my settling here would bring trouble to anyone else. Rose moved to stand beside him, her earlier nervousness replaced by a fierce determination. That surprised even her. Don't you dare apologize for Frank Morrison's behavior. He's been pushing people around this valley for months, thinking his money and connections make him untouchable. Doc Hayes nodded grimly. Rose is right. Morrison's been buying up properties for months, often at prices well below market value. Folks who've refused to sell have had mysterious accidents, cattle wandering off, wells going dry. Nothing that could be proved, but the pattern's been clear to anyone paying attention. Jake absorbed this information with growing anger, not just at Morrison's tactics, but at the realization that Rose and the other people of Silverbrook had been living under this kind of pressure. The protective instincts that had driven him to step between Morrison and Rose were now extending to the entire community that had welcomed him so warmly. "What does he want?" Jake asked. "It can't just be about controlling ranch land." "Railroad," Doc Hayes explained. "There's talk of a new line coming through this valley within the next 2 years. Morrison's been positioning himself to control the land where the depot would most likely be built. A man who owned that property could make a fortune, not just from the railroad, but from the town that would grow up around it." Rose added her own observations, gained from months of listening to conversations in the saloon. "He's also been talking to men from back east, investors who want to turn this whole valley into some kind of cattle empire. Small ranchers like. The Circle S don't fit into those plans." The implications were staggering. Morrison wasn't just trying to intimidate one newcomer. He was systematically working to control the entire economic future of Silverbrook and the surrounding territory. The hired gun suggested he was willing to use violence to achieve his goals, and Jake's arrival had apparently accelerated whatever timeline Morrison had been following. "I need to get to the bank," Jake said finally, "if I'm going to be a target. Anyway, I might as well make it official by buying that land." Rose caught his arm as he turned to leave, her touch sending the same electric sensation through both of them as it had earlier. "Jake, be careful. Morrison's not the kind of man who makes empty threats." The use of his first name, spoken with such obvious concern, affected Jake more than all of Morrison's intimidation combined. Looking down into Rose's worried eyes, he felt something shift inside his chest, a fierce protectiveness that went far beyond simple attraction. This woman, who barely knew him, was genuinely concerned for his safety, and the realization that someone cared about what happened to him was both humbling and inspiring. "I'll be careful," he promised, his large hand covering hers where it rested on his arm. "But I won't be run off by threats and hired guns. This valley deserves better than Frank Morrison." The transaction at the bank proved surprisingly simple, despite Jake's concerns about potential interference from Morrison. The banker, a nervous little man named Cornelius Whitman, processed the paperwork with obvious relief, explaining that the Crawford nephew had been pressuring him for months to finalize the sale. The $3,000 changed hands without incident, and within an hour, Jake Sullivan was the legal owner of the Circle S ranch. Word of the purchase spread through Silverbrook with the speed that only small towns could achieve. By noon, Jake found himself receiving congratulations from people he'd barely met, each offering advice, assistance, or simply expressing pleasure that the Crawford place would be in good hands again. The warmth of their reception contrasted sharply with Morrison's hostility, reinforcing Jake's sense that he'd made the right decision despite the obvious risks. That afternoon, Jake rode out to his new property with a wagon load of supplies and a heart full of plans for the future. The house needed work, the barn required some repairs, and the corrals would benefit from expansion, but the bones of a successful operation were already in place. More importantly, standing on his own land and looking out over his own pastures, Jake began to envision a life that included more than just horses and cattle. As evening approached, he found himself thinking about Rose McKenna with increasing frequency. Her courage in standing up to Morrison, her genuine concern for his safety, and the way her touch had affected him all suggested possibilities he'd never seriously considered. Jake had always assumed that his size and solitary nature made him unsuitable for marriage and family, but Rose's obvious lack of intimidation and her appreciation for his gentle manner made him wonder if he might have been wrong about his prospects for personal happiness. The ride back to town took him past several other ranches where he noticed signs of the pressure Morrison had been applying. Fences cut and hastily repaired, cattle bunched unnaturally as if they'd been driven away from water sources and buildings, showing damage that looked suspiciously like vandalism. The pattern Doc Hayes had described was clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for, and Jake's anger at Morrison's tactics continued to grow. Returning to the Silver Dollar for dinner, Jake found the evening crowd in full swing. Cowboys from surrounding spreads mixed with townspeople and travelers, creating the kind of lively atmosphere that made frontier saloons the social centers of their communities. Rose moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her friendly manner and quick wit making her popular with customers, while her obvious intelligence kept even the roughest men respectful. Jake settled at the same corner table he'd occupied the day before, content to watch Rose work while enjoying another excellent meal from Hank Carter's kitchen. He was struck again by how different she was from other women in her position, carrying herself with dignity and confidence that commanded respect rather than unwanted attention. There was a strength about Rose McKenna that went far deeper than mere physical beauty, and Jake found himself increasingly drawn to the combination of qualities that made her so remarkable. Their eyes met several times during the evening, brief exchanges of glances that carried increasing weight as the night progressed. When Rose finally had a moment to approach his table, Jake felt his pulse quicken in a way that would have embarrassed him if anyone else had noticed. "How did things go at the bank?" she asked, refilling his coffee cup and lingering beside his table longer than strictly necessary. "The Circle S Ranch is officially mine," Jake replied, unable to suppress a smile of satisfaction. "Papers are signed, money's changed hands, and I'm now a legitimate landowner in this valley." Rose's answering smile was radiant, transforming her already beautiful face into something that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. "That's wonderful news. I'm so happy for you." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and Jake found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by her genuine enthusiasm for his success. "I was wondering, Miss McKenna, if you might consider letting me escort you home this evening. With Morrison's threats and those hired guns in town, I'd feel better knowing you got back safely." Rose hesitated, not from any fear of Jake, but from the awareness that accepting his escort would represent a significant step in whatever was developing between them. Frontier communities were small enough that any public association between a man and woman quickly became the subject of widespread speculation, and Rose had worked hard to maintain her reputation and independence. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Sullivan," she said finally, "but I usually stay until closing to help Hank with the cleanup. It wouldn't be fair to ask you to wait that long." Jake's response was immediate and earnest. "I don't mind waiting, Miss McKenna. In fact, I'd consider it a privilege to ensure your safety." The old-fashioned gallantry in his words, combined with the obvious sincerity of his concern, touched something deep in Rose's heart. Most men who offered to escort her home had far different motivations, but Jake's respectful manner and genuine worry for her well-being suggested intentions that were both honorable and appealing. "In that case," she said softly, "I'd be grateful for your company." As the evening wound down and the last customers departed, Jake helped Rose and Hank with the cleaning, his massive hands proving surprisingly gentle with delicate glassware, and his quiet presence adding an air of security to the nightly routine. Hank, who'd been protective of Rose since her arrival in Silverbrook, found himself approving of the big cowboy's obvious respect for her and his willingness to help without being asked. The walk to Rose's boarding house took them through the quiet streets of Silverbrook, where lamplight from scattered windows created pools of yellow warmth in the darkness. They moved slowly, both reluctant to end an evening that had marked a turning point in their relationship, talking quietly about their hopes for the future and their observations about life in the frontier territory. "I need to tell you something," Rose said as they approached her destination, her voice carrying the seriousness that made Jake's attention sharpen. "Frank Morrison has been persistent in his attentions toward me for months. He seems to think that his wealth and position give him certain rights, and he doesn't accept refusal gracefully." Jake felt a cold anger settle in his chest at this revelation, his protective instincts flaring at the thought of Morrison pressuring Rose. "Has he threatened you directly?" "Nothing I could prove," Rose replied honestly. "But there have been implications, suggestions that my position at the Silver Dollar might become difficult if I continue to be uncooperative. Today was the first time he's been so open about his methods." They stopped in front of the boarding house, a neat two-story building where Rose rented a small but comfortable room. In the dim light from the porch lamp, Jake could see the worry in her eyes, and he realized that Morrison's intimidation had been affecting her far longer than anyone had suspected. "Miss McKenna," Jake said carefully, choosing his words with the awareness that his next statement could change everything between them. "I want you to know that as long as I'm in this valley, you don't have to face Frank Morrison's threats alone. I may be new to Silverbrook, but I believe in protecting people who can't protect themselves, especially when those people have shown me nothing but kindness." Rose looked up into his eyes, seeing there a strength and determination that made her feel safer than she had in months. There was more than simple chivalry in Jake's offer. There was a personal investment that suggested his feelings for her were growing as quickly as hers were for him. "Thank you," she said softly, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture that had become familiar between them. "That means more to me than you know." As Rose disappeared into the boarding house, Jake stood for a moment in the quiet street, feeling the weight of responsibilities he'd never anticipated when he'd first ridden into Silverbrook. He'd come here looking for land and a chance to build a horse operation, but he was discovering that some things were more important: personal ambition, the safety and well-being of Rose McKenna, and by extension the entire community of Silverbrook, had become causes worth fighting for, no matter what Frank Morrison and his hired guns might have in store. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after Jake had officially taken possession of the Circle S ranch. He'd risen before dawn as was his custom, planning to begin repairs on the barn's roof before the autumn weather turned harsh, when he discovered that someone had cut his fence lines during the night. Not random vandalism, but systematic destruction that would allow his horses to wander onto neighboring properties where they might be claimed as strays or worse. Standing in the crisp morning air, examining the cleanly cut wire and deliberately damaged fence posts, Jake felt his jaw tighten with controlled anger. This wasn't the work of drifters or casual troublemakers. It bore all the hallmarks of Morrison's systematic campaign of intimidation. The cuts had been made with professional tools, and the timing suggested that whoever had done this knew his routines well enough to strike when he'd be least likely to discover the damage quickly. Thunder snorted nervously from his stall in the barn, sensing his master's tension, while the other horses milled restlessly in the corral. They'd been spooked by something during the night, their behavior suggesting that strangers had been moving around the property while Jake slept. The violation of his land felt personal in a way that surprised him with its intensity, not just because of the damage but because it represented a direct challenge to his right to build a life in Silverbrook. Working methodically to repair the fence, Jake's mind turned to the broader implications of Morrison's escalating campaign. The cattle baron clearly wasn't content to wait for economic pressure or legal maneuvering to achieve his goals. He was moving to direct action that could easily escalate to violence. More troubling was the realization that Rose and the other people of Silverbrook remained vulnerable to Morrison's retaliation, especially if Jake's presence continued to interfere with whatever timeline the man had established for controlling the valley. By mid-morning, Jake had completed temporary repairs to the fence and ridden into town to purchase proper materials for a more permanent solution. He found Silverbrook buzzing with news that made his blood run cold. During the night, someone had broken into the boarding house where Rose lived, though nothing had apparently been stolen and no one had been harmed. The message was clear enough to anyone paying attention. Morrison's reach extended beyond business disputes into direct threats against those who associated with his enemies. Rose was behind the bar at the Silver Dollar when Jake arrived, her usual composure intact, but something fragile in her eyes that suggested the night's events had shaken her more than she was willing to admit. She looked up as he entered, and the relief that flickered across her face at seeing him safe made Jake's chest tighten with emotions he was still learning to identify. "I heard about the boarding house," he said without preamble, his voice pitched low enough that other customers couldn't overhear. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Rose replied, but her hands trembled slightly as she wiped down the bar. Mrs. Patterson heard someone moving around downstairs around midnight, but by the time she worked up the courage to investigate, whoever it was had already gone. Nothing was taken, but she paused, meeting his eyes directly. "My door handle had been turned. Someone stood outside my room during the night." The quiet terror in her admission hit Jake like a physical blow. The thought of Rose lying awake in the darkness, knowing that someone with unknown intentions had been just outside her door, filled him with a protective rage that surprised him with its intensity. Morrison's escalation from property damage to personal intimidation crossed a line that Jake couldn't ignore, regardless of the potential consequences. "Pack your things," Jake said firmly. "You're not spending another night at that boarding house." Rose's eyes widened at the determination in his voice. "I can't just leave. Where would I go? I don't have the money for the hotel, and there aren't exactly an abundance of options in Silverbrook for a woman in my position." Jake had been thinking about this possibility ever since Doc Hayes had first explained Morrison's tactics, though he'd hoped it wouldn't become necessary so soon. "The ranch house has plenty of room, and there's a separate bedroom that locks from the inside. You'd be safe there, and I could use the help getting the place properly organized anyway." The suggestion hung in the air between them, both understanding the social implications of an unmarried woman living on a bachelor's ranch. In frontier communities, such arrangements were often viewed with suspicion, regardless of the practical necessity or the honor of those involved. Rose's reputation, which she'd worked so hard to maintain, could suffer irreparable damage from such an association. "Jake," she said softly, using his first name naturally now, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you know as well as I do what people would say. It wouldn't be fair to either of us." Before Jake could respond, Hank Carter emerged from the kitchen, his weathered face grave with concern. He'd obviously overheard at least part of their conversation, and his expression suggested he'd been wrestling with the same concerns about Rose's safety that were troubling Jake. "Rose," Hank said quietly, "I've been thinking about this situation all morning, and I believe Jake's right. Morrison's message last night was clear enough, and it's only going to get worse. Your safety is more important than gossip." Doc Hayes chose that moment to enter the saloon, his medical bag in hand and his face showing the exhaustion of a man who'd been up most of the night. "Morning, folks. Just finished checking on old Mrs. Patterson. She's pretty shaken up by the break-in, but physically she's fine." He settled heavily onto a bar stool, accepting the coffee that Rose automatically poured for him. "I don't suppose anyone's heard about the trouble out at the Morrison place?" Jake's attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of trouble?" Doc Hayes took a long sip of coffee before answering, his eyes holding a gleam that suggested the news might not be entirely unwelcome. Seems someone paid Frank a visit during the night too. Found his prize breeding bull loose in the yard this morning. His fence posts pulled clean out of the ground. Those two gunmen of his spent the morning chasing cattle back into their proper pastures. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidental, and Jake found himself wondering if Silverbrook had other protectors he hadn't yet discovered. Someone with the skills and motivation to turn Morrison's own tactics against him had clearly decided that the cattle baron's escalation deserved an appropriate response. "Any idea who might have been responsible?" Jake asked carefully. "Doc." Hayes shrugged with elaborate innocence. "Could have been anybody, I suppose. Lots of folks in this valley have reason to be unhappy with Frank Morrison's methods. Sometimes the frontier has its own way of delivering justice." Rose looked between the two men, understanding dawning in her eyes. "There are others, aren't there? Other people who've decided they've had enough of Morrison's intimidation." "What there are," Doc Hayes said carefully, "are good people who believe in protecting their community from bullies and thieves. People who understand that sometimes the law needs a little assistance in maintaining proper order." The implications were staggering. Rather than being an isolated target facing Morrison's organization alone, Jake was apparently part of a larger network of resistance that had been developing in response to the cattle baron's increasing aggression. The knowledge that others were willing to take risks to protect their neighbors and their way of life was both comforting and concerning, suggesting that the conflict was likely to escalate far beyond simple business disputes. Hank Carter leaned across the bar, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a meeting tonight, Jake. Barn behind the old Patterson place, just after moonrise. Some of the local ranchers think it's time to coordinate our response to Morrison's tactics." Jake nodded slowly, understanding that he was being invited to join something that went far beyond his personal conflict with Morrison. The people of Silverbrook were organizing to defend their community, and they apparently considered him a valuable addition to their efforts. "What about Rose?" Jake asked. "She can't stay at the boarding house with Morrison's men prowling around at night." Doc Hayes studied Rose with the careful attention of someone assessing both physical safety and social implications. "Actually, I might have a solution for that. My wife Nancy has been asking for help with her seamstress work, especially with winter coming on and everyone needing heavier clothes. We've got a spare room above our clinic, and having Rose there would give Nancy the assistance she needs while keeping her safe." The offer was perfect, providing Rose with respectable shelter while associating her with one of Silverbrook's most respected families. More importantly, Doc Hayes' reputation for integrity would shield her from any gossip about improper arrangements or questionable motivations. Rose's relief was visible as she considered the proposal. "That's incredibly generous, Doc. Are you sure Nancy wouldn't mind the imposition?" "Mind," Doc Hayes chuckled. "She'll be delighted to have the company and the help. Nancy's been feeling isolated lately with all this tension in the valley, and having another woman around will do her a world of good." As they finalized the arrangements for Rose's temporary relocation, Jake found himself impressed by the way the community was rallying to protect one of their own. The frontier might be harsh and unforgiving, but it also fostered a sense of mutual dependence and collective responsibility that was rare in more settled areas. People looked out for each other because survival often depended on such cooperation. That afternoon, Jake threw himself into the work of improving his ranch's defenses with the intensity that reflected both his practical concerns and his need to channel his growing anger into productive activity. He reinforced the fence lines with extra wire, positioned his horses in corrals that could be easily defended, and began construction of a more secure barn that would protect his livestock from both weather and human threats. The physical labor felt good, burning off nervous energy while accomplishing necessary tasks that would serve him well, regardless of how the conflict with Morrison developed. As he worked, Jake found his thoughts turning repeatedly to Rose and the courage she'd shown in the face of increasingly direct intimidation, her determination to maintain her independence and dignity despite Morrison's pressure spoke to a strength of character that made his growing feelings for her seem less like romantic infatuation and more like genuine respect for a remarkable woman. Evening found Jake riding toward the Patterson barn with mixed feelings about the clandestine meeting ahead. He'd never been involved in organized resistance before, preferring to handle his problems directly rather than through group action. But Morrison's tactics clearly required a coordinated response that no individual could provide alone. The barn sat in a hollow behind the Patterson homestead, its weathered walls providing cover from both wind and observation. Jake arrived to find a dozen men already gathered, their faces grim in the flickering light of carefully shielded lanterns. He recognized most of them, small ranchers, shopkeepers, and working cowboys who'd grown tired of Morrison's systematic campaign of intimidation. Old Pete Murphy from the livery stable seemed to be serving as an unofficial leader, his weathered face serious as he addressed the group. "Boys, I reckon we all know why we're here." Frank Morrison's escalated his campaign beyond property disputes, and it's time we sent him a message about how decent folks respond to threats against women and families. A murmur of agreement ran through the assembled men, their anger at Morrison's tactics evident in their postures and expressions. Jake noticed that several of them carried weapons, suggesting that they understood the potential consequences of organized resistance against Morrison's hired guns. "Jake Sullivan," Pete continued, nodding toward the newest member of their informal organization, "you've gotten a first-hand taste of Morrison's methods. Care to share your thoughts about how we should respond?" Jake considered his words carefully, understanding that his input could influence the direction of their resistance. "I think Morrison understands one thing: strength. He's been getting away with intimidation because he believes he's stronger than any individual who might oppose him. We need to show him that he's not facing individuals anymore." A grizzled rancher named Tom Watson spoke up from the back of the group. "Easy enough to say, but Morrison's got money, political connections, and hired guns. What do we have besides righteous anger and good intentions?" "We have something he doesn't," Jake replied firmly. "We have the support of this community and the moral authority that comes from defending our homes and families. Morrison's fighting for greed and power. We're fighting for our right to live free from intimidation." The distinction resonated with the assembled men, several of whom nodded their approval of Jake's analysis. These were men who'd come west seeking freedom and opportunity, and Morrison's systematic campaign of control represented everything they'd left behind in more settled areas. Doc Hayes, who'd arrived late and positioned himself near the door, added his own perspective to the discussion. "We also have the advantage of knowing this territory better than Morrison's hired help. They're strangers here, dependent on Morrison for information and support. We're fighting on our own ground." The meeting continued for another hour, with various members of the group proposing strategies for countering Morrison's tactics. Some favored direct confrontation, others preferred subtle sabotage, and a few suggested legal remedies that everyone knew would be ineffective given Morrison's political connections. Gradually, a consensus emerged around a campaign of measured resistance that would demonstrate their unity while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. "We make it clear to Morrison that his actions have consequences," Pete Murphy summarized. "Every time he threatens one of us, something happens to remind him that he's not untouchable. Nothing that can't be explained as natural misfortune, but consistent enough that he gets the message." Jake found himself appointed to coordinate defenses for the outlying ranches, his military bearing and obvious competence making him a natural choice for tactical planning. The responsibility was both flattering and sobering, representing the community's trust in his judgment while making him a more visible target for Morrison's retaliation. As the meeting broke up and the men dispersed into the night, Jake lingered to speak privately with Doc Hayes about Rose's situation. The physician's offer to shelter her had removed Jake's most immediate concern, but the broader implications of Morrison's escalation troubled him deeply. "Doc," Jake said quietly, "what do you think Morrison's ultimate goal really is? This seems like an awful lot of trouble just to control railland or expand his cattle operation." Doc Hayes was silent for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the dying lantern light. "I've been wondering the same thing. Jake, Morrison's got enough land and money to prosper without driving out every small rancher in the valley. There's something personal in his campaign, something that goes beyond simple business competition." The observation was troubling, suggesting that Morrison's motivations might be more complex and dangerous than simple greed. Personal vendettas were often more bitter and lasting than business disputes, and they frequently escalated to violence regardless of practical considerations. "Keep an eye on Rose," Jake said as they prepared to part ways. "Morrison's threats against her feel different somehow, more focused than his general intimidation campaign." Doc Hayes nodded grimly. "Nancy and I will take good care of her. And Jake, watch your back out at that ranch. You've made yourself the most visible symbol of resistance to Morrison's plans, and men like him don't forgive that kind of defiance." The ride back to the Circle S took Jake through country that looked different in the moonlight, full of shadows that could conceal threats and terrain that could either shelter or trap a man depending on circumstances. He found himself cataloging defensive positions and escape routes with the automatic assessment of someone who'd learned to think tactically about survival. Back at his ranch house, Jake sat on the porch for a long time, listening to the night sounds of his property and thinking about the rapid changes that had transformed his simple plan to settle down into something far more complex and dangerous. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a solitary cowboy with nothing more complicated to worry about than finding good land and building a horse operation. Now he was part of an organized resistance against a powerful enemy, responsible for coordinating the defense of his neighbors and deeply involved with a woman whose safety had become more important to him than his own. The transformation should have been overwhelming, but instead Jake found it oddly satisfying. For the first time in his adult life, he was fighting for something more meaningful than personal advancement or individual survival. The people of Silverbrook had welcomed him as one of their own, and Rose McKenna had shown him possibilities for happiness he'd never dared to imagine. Whatever Morrison had planned, Jake was ready to face it as part of a community worth defending. As if summoned by his thoughts, thunder nickered softly from the corral, responding to some sound or scent that Jake's duller human senses couldn't detect. Moving carefully to avoid silhouetting himself against the house lights, Jake peered into the darkness surrounding his property, searching for any sign of unwelcome visitors. The night remained quiet, but Jake's instincts told him that the real conflict was just beginning. Morrison had shown his willingness to escalate beyond property disputes to personal threats, and the formation of organized resistance would likely provoke an even stronger response. The next few days would test both the unity of Silverbrook's defenders and the depth of Morrison's commitment to his mysterious goals. Inside the house, Jake checked his weapons and began planning defensive improvements that would serve him well in the battles to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he was content to know that Rose was safe with the Hayes family and that he was no longer facing Morrison's threats alone. The giant cowboy who'd ridden into Silverbrook looking for land and peace had found instead a cause worth fighting for and a woman worth protecting, and he was discovering that some things were more valuable than the quiet life he'd originally planned. The showdown that would determine Silverbrook's future came on a crisp October morning when the aspens had turned to gold and the first frost had touched the mountain peaks. Frank Morrison arrived in town with 20 hired guns, their weapons gleaming in the pale sunlight as they took up positions throughout the settlement. Word spread quickly through the community that Morrison had issued an ultimatum. All resistance to his plans would cease within 24 hours, or he would Take direct action to remove the obstacles to his vision for the valley. Jake received the news while working on his barn roof, the sound of thunder's urgent whinnying alerting him to approaching riders long before they came into view. Young Billy Thompson, the deputy sheriff's son, rode his horse hard into the ranch yard, his face flushed with excitement and fear as he delivered the message that would change everything. "Mr. Sullivan," the boy gasped, fighting to catch his breath, "you need to come to town right away. Morrison's got the whole place surrounded, and he's demanding that everyone who's been organizing against him surrender themselves for what he calls justice." Jake climbed down from the roof with deliberate calm, his mind already shifting into the tactical mode that had served him well during the dangerous years before he'd found peace in Silverbrook. Morrison's decision to force a confrontation meant that subtlety and patience had given way to the kind of direct action that would determine once and for all who controlled the valley's future. "How many men did he bring?" Jake asked, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "Maybe 20, all armed with rifles and pistols. They've got the main street covered, and some of them are positioned on the rooftops. Sheriff Bradley's holed up in his office with Deputy Wilson, but they're outnumbered 10 to 1. The tactical situation was dire, but not impossible. Morrison's men might have superior numbers and weapons, but they were strangers fighting on unfamiliar ground, against people defending their homes and families. More importantly, Jake suspected that Morrison's hired guns were motivated primarily by money rather than conviction, which could make them vulnerable to determined resistance. "Billy," Jake said firmly, "I want you to ride to every ranch and farm in the valley. Tell everyone to stay away from town until this is settled. And find Doc Hayes. Tell him to get Rose somewhere safe and keep her there no matter what happens." The boy nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have a specific mission that would take him away from the developing conflict. As he rode off to spread the warning, Jake made his own preparations for what might be his final confrontation with Frank Morrison. He strapped on his gun belt, checked his rifle, and saddled Thunder with the careful attention to detail that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. The ride into Silverbrook took Jake through country he'd come to love during his brief months as a rancher, past the creek, where he'd watered his horses, and through the meadows where he'd planned to graze cattle in the coming spring. The beauty of the landscape contrasted sharply with the violence that was about to unfold in its midst, reminding him of how much he stood to lose if Morrison's ultimatum succeeded. As he approached the town's outskirts, Jake could see Morrison's men positioned strategically throughout Silverbrook, their rifles trained on key buildings and intersections. The streets were empty of civilians, creating an eerie silence that was broken only by the occasional nervous movement of a horse or the creak of leather as one of the gunmen shifted position. Morrison himself stood in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon, his expensive clothes and confident bearing marking him as clearly as a uniform. He'd positioned himself where everyone in town could see him, making a statement about his power and his determination to use it against anyone who continued to oppose his plans. Jake dismounted at the edge of town and approached on foot, his hands visible but ready to move quickly if the situation demanded violence. He could feel the weight of watching eyes from windows and doorways, townspeople who'd taken shelter but remained close enough to witness the confrontation that would determine their community's fate. "Frank Morrison," Jake called out when he was still 50 yards away, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I hear you've got something to say to the people of Silverbrook." Morrison turned to face him, his smile cold and triumphant. "Jake Sullivan, I was hoping you'd be reasonable enough to accept my invitation. It saves us the trouble of dragging you out of whatever hole you might have found to hide in." The insult was calculated to provoke an angry response, but Jake had learned long ago to control his temper when facing dangerous men. Instead, he continued his measured approach, his eyes cataloging the positions of Morrison's gunmen while maintaining the appearance of calm confidence. "I'm here," Jake said simply, What's your proposition?" Morrison's laughter was harsh and without humor. "Proposition? Mr. Sullivan, I think you've misunderstood the nature of this gathering. This isn't a negotiation. It's a surrender ceremony. You and your fellow troublemakers are going to publicly acknowledge my authority in this valley, and then you're going to leave, permanently." The demand was exactly what Jake had expected, but hearing it spoken aloud crystallized his determination to resist regardless of the personal cost. Morrison's vision for Silverbrook would destroy everything that made the community special, turning it into just another corporate enterprise where people existed at the sufferance of distant investors. "And if we refuse?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Morrison's gesture encompassed his armed men and their commanding positions throughout the town. "Then we'll remove you by whatever means prove necessary. I've invested too much time and money in this valley to let a handful of stubborn ranchers interfere with progress." The moment of truth had arrived, and Jake felt a strange calm settle over him as he prepared to make the choice that would define the rest of his life. He could surrender, accept exile, and preserve his own safety while abandoning the people who'd welcomed him as one of their own. Or he could stand and fight, knowing that his individual resistance might inspire others to join him but would almost certainly result in his death. Before he could respond to Morrison's ultimatum, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the streets, and Jake turned to see riders emerging from multiple directions. Old Pete Murphy led a group of ranchers from the north, while Doc Hayes guided townspeople from the east. Sheriff Bradley and Deputy Wilson had left their office and were approaching from the south, their badges gleaming in the morning sun. Most surprising of all was the sight of Rose McKenna walking down the main street, her chin held high and her green dress bright against the dusty buildings. She moved with determined grace, seemingly oblivious to the weapons trained in her direction, until she reached Jake's side and took his arm with quiet confidence. "I thought you were supposed to stay safe," Jake said softly, his heart racing with both fear for her well-being and admiration for her courage. "Silverbrook is my home too," Rose replied firmly. "If you're making a stand for our community, then I'm making it with you." Morrison's expression darkened as he realized that his demonstration of force had produced the opposite effect from what he'd intended. Instead of intimidating the townspeople into submission, his ultimatum had united them in resistance. More concerning from a tactical standpoint, the arrival of additional defenders had changed the odds considerably, turning what should have been a simple surrender ceremony into a potential battlefield. "This is your last chance," Morrison shouted, his voice carrying the note of desperation that suggested he understood how quickly the situation was slipping away from his control. "Surrender now, or face the consequences of defying legitimate authority." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his weathered face grim with determination. "Frank Morrison, by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy, intimidation, and inciting violence. Order your men to lay down their weapons." Morrison's laughter was bitter and incredulous. "You think your little badge gives you authority over me, Bradley? I have connections that reach all the way to Washington. You're nothing but a local puppet who's forgotten his place." The insult to their elected representative sparked angry murmurs from the assembled townspeople, their resentment at Morrison's arrogance overcoming their fear of his hired guns. Jake could feel the mood shifting from nervous resistance to determined defiance, and he realized that Morrison had made a crucial error in underestimating the community's unity. What happened next would be debated in Silverbrook for years to come, with different witnesses providing varying accounts of who moved first and why. What everyone agreed on was that the confrontation exploded into violence with shocking suddenness, transforming the quiet street into a battlefield in the space of heartbeats. Morrison, perhaps sensing that his position was becoming untenable, reached for the pistol at his hip while shouting orders to his men to open fire. Jake's response was instantaneous and precise. his own weapon appearing in his hand with the speed that had made him legendary in other places and times. The shot that dropped Morrison was clean and final, removing the source of months of intimidation in a single moment of violence. The battle that followed was brief but decisive, as Morrison's hired guns discovered the difference between fighting for money and fighting for home. The townspeople of Silverbrook, led by men like Jake and Sheriff Bradley, fought with the desperate courage of people defending everything they valued, while their opponents found themselves increasingly isolated and demoralized by the fall of their leader. Within minutes, the surviving gunmen were either dead, wounded, or attempting to surrender to Sheriff Bradley's authority. The street that had been filled with threats and tension was now littered with the debris of violence, but the outcome was clear. Silverbrook would remain a community of independent people rather than becoming Morrison's corporate fiefdom. In the aftermath of the battle, as Doc Hayes tended to the wounded and Sheriff Bradley dealt with prisoners, Jake found himself standing with Rose in front of the $1 Saloon, both of them amazed to have survived the confrontation that had seemed so likely to end in their deaths. "It's over," Rose said softly, her hand finding his with the naturalness that had developed between them during their brief but intense courtship. "We're really free of him." Jake nodded, but his thoughts were already turning to the future and the questions that Morrison's defeat had left unanswered. The immediate threat was gone, but the valley would need new leadership and direction as it recovered from months of intimidation and violence. "Rose," he said carefully, understanding that his next words would determine the shape of his life, "I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. About what it means to have a home, and what it takes to build something lasting in a place like this." She looked up at him with eyes that held both hope and wariness, recognizing the seriousness in his tone. "What kind of things?" Jake took a deep breath, summoning the courage to speak words he'd never imagined himself saying. "I've been thinking about how empty that ranch house feels at night, and how much better everything seems when you're nearby. I've been thinking about marriage, Rose, and about building a life together instead of just building a horse operation." The proposal was simple and direct, lacking the elaborate romanticism that some women might have expected, but it carried the weight of genuine emotion and honest intention. Rose had seen Jake face down armed men without flinching, but now he looked almost vulnerable as he waited for her response. "Jake Sullivan," she said with a smile that made the morning sun seem dim by comparison. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd consider sharing your life with a giant cowboy who loves you more than he ever thought possible," Jake replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I'm not much to look at, and I can't offer you the kind of refined life you might find in more civilized places, but I can promise you'll never want for anything as long as I'm alive to provide it." Rose's answer came in the form of a kiss that was witnessed by half the town and would be remembered as the moment when Silverbrook's newest love story truly began. When they finally separated, both were laughing with the joy of people who'd found something precious amid the chaos of frontier life. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, officiated by the traveling circuit judge in a ceremony that brought together the entire community in celebration of both the couple's happiness and their collective victory over Morrison's tyranny. The $1 Saloon hosted the reception, with Hank Carter providing his finest food and drink for the occasion. As the celebration continued into the evening, Jake and Rose slipped away from the crowd to stand on the porch of what would soon be their shared home, looking out over the valley that had become the foundation of their future together. The Circles Ranch stretched before them in the moonlight, its pastures and buildings representing not just economic opportunity, but the promise of a life built on love, community, and mutual respect. "Do you ever regret leaving your old life behind?" Rose asked, leaning against Jake's massive frame with comfortable familiarity. Jake considered the question seriously, thinking about the years of solitary wandering that had brought him to Silverbrook and the chain of events that had led to this moment. Not for a second, he said finally. I spent years looking for something I couldn't even name, and I found it here with you. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with the promise of shared dreams and common purpose. There would be horses to breed and train, cattle to raise, and a community to help build into something even better than what they'd fought to preserve. Most importantly, there would be the daily joy of waking up beside someone who understood and appreciated the man behind the legend. As the sounds of celebration drifted from the town below, Jake pulled Rose closer and marveled at how completely his life had changed since that first morning, when he'd ridden into Silverbrook looking for nothing more complicated than good land and a fresh start. He'd found instead a love story worthy of the frontier itself, complete with danger, courage, and the kind of happy ending that made all the struggles worthwhile. The giant cowboy who'd once believed himself too different for ordinary happiness had learned that the right woman could see past size and reputation to the gentle heart beneath. And the saloon girl who'd thought herself limited by circumstances and social expectations had discovered that true love could indeed conquer the barriers that seemed insurmountable to lesser partnerships. Together, they would build something lasting in the Colorado Territory, a legacy of love and community that would endure long after the stories of their romance had become legend in the valleys and mountains of the West. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.